Thank you, Mr. Jonathan Reed, for sending me such a profoundly moving story via email. Today, Dust and Destiny is honored to share with you a true story, recounted from the letter he sent, that takes us deep into the unforgiving heart of the Montana frontier in 1869, a place where survival often hinged not on law, but on courage, honor, and the faint glimmer of human kindness. The storm hit without warning. A blizzard of a severity that seemed almost biblical swept across the endless Montana plains, turning the horizon into an indistinguishable wall of white. The wind tore through the skeletal trees and bent the tall grasses into submission, carrying with it the scent of ice and fear. It was in the midst of this storm that Evelyn Carter, a young bride who had been sent on a simple errand to deliver letters to a nearby ranch, found herself hopelessly lost. She was supposed to reach Carter Ranch, but the snow and confusion led her to the wrong place entirely. A place she would come to learn was known as Red Bluff Ranch. A place ruled less by written law than by the rigid codes of the land and the unspoken truths of those who called it home. Evelyn's knuckles were white as she rapped on the heavy, frost-lined door. When it creaked open, the sight before her stole the breath from her lungs. Standing in the doorway was Nantan Greyhawk, a widowed Apache man whose reputation for quiet strength and unyielding resolve stretched across the county. Behind him, barely visible in the shadows, a small figure clung to his coat. The child's hand brushing against the rough fabric, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. The child, Nita, had not spoken a word in 3 long years. Trauma had silenced her, locking away the little girl's voice behind a wall of grief that no lullaby or comfort could breach. Yet, in that instant, as the wind rattled the door and snow hissed across the porch, Nita's lips trembled and then parted to whisper the words that would forever change the course of that frozen night. God sent you to us. It was a sentence so fragile yet so piercing that it seemed to hang in the storm-tossed air, fragile as ice on a river, yet impossibly weighty. Nantan's eyes, dark and unreadable as a winter night, softened just slightly. He had lived a life hardened by loss and shadowed by sorrow. His wife, Elena, whose photograph still rested above the hearth, had been taken from him too soon. The scarf she had knitted for Nita, now draped over a chair, still carried the faint scent of her. And the piano, silent for years, seemed almost to mourn with the boy and the man alike. These were the fragments of a life shattered, and yet they were also reminders of what had been worth protecting. Evelyn, the stranger who had stumbled into this frozen tableau by chance, or perhaps by fate, stood shivering in the doorway, her own courage battling with the fear that gripped her heart. She could not return. The blizzard made the journey back impossible, and yet, there was something in the way Nantan studied her. Something that suggested a man who understood danger but also understood the rare, fleeting moments when destiny demands a choice. With a voice roughened by wind and years of restraint, Nantan finally spoke. "You can stay. For the night," he said. It was a simple gesture, yet monumental. For in a world where trust was as scarce as warmth in a Montana winter, offering shelter was tantamount to laying one's soul bare. Nita, sensing the shift, stepped forward slightly and repeated, just a little louder, "God sent you to us." The cabin seemed to breathe with a newfound tension and possibility. Outside, the storm raged with indifferent fury, a reminder that the frontier's law was as fleeting as footprints in the snow. Inside, a fragile alliance of strangers and survivors began to form, woven together by necessity, fear, and the faint stirrings of hope. This moment, frozen between fear and trust, marked the start of a moral crossroads. Should Nantan close the door to the unknown, securing the small measure of safety he had fought so hard to preserve, and leave destiny unheeded? Or should he step forward, opening his home to a stranger in the teeth of a merciless blizzard, trusting that the unseen hand of fate had chosen this night for a reason? The stakes were more than just shelter from the cold. They were a test of courage, a reckoning with grief, and a confrontation with the fragile, often brutal, code of justice that governed the Montana frontier. And so we leave you with this question, one that lingers like the chill in a long, silent hallway. If you were Nantan Greyhawk, would you shut the door against the storm, safeguarding the fragile life you have left? Or would you let the hand of destiny walk into your home, bringing both peril and possibility? Tonight, dear viewers, as Dust and Destiny unfolds this story, remember that the West was a place where the lines between right and wrong were drawn not by courts, but by courage, honor, and sometimes by the whispers of a child who had been silent too long. In the coming minutes, we will follow Nantan, Evelyn, and Nita through a night that will test the very limits of their trust, their courage, and their humanity, on a land where justice is scarce, danger is constant, and hope is a flickering candle in the wind. The storm had eased by morning, leaving the Montana prairie an expanse of blinding white, silent but for the occasional creak of a frozen tree limb or the distant howl of a coyote. Inside Red Bluff Ranch, however, the air was warmer, suffused with the faint aroma of burning pine and the unspoken tensions that filled the cramped cabin. Nantan Greyhawk moved with a quiet efficiency, each action deliberate, each gesture measured. He added logs to the fire without speaking, securing the shutters against the wind, and set a bowl of hot stew on the wooden table, steam curling upward in fragile spirals. Every small act was a stitch in the invisible fabric of trust he was beginning to weave around the two unexpected intruders into his life. To an outsider, it might have seemed mere hospitality, but for Nantan, it was a tentative attempt to repair broken hearts, a silent way of saying, "I am not as closed off as the world believes." Nita, perched on the wide windowsill, observed with wide, cautious eyes. The little girl had spent 3 years in silence, her voice smothered by trauma, yet her hands were eloquent in ways words could not reach. She placed a stack of crude drawings on the table, stick figures under a blazing sun. A man, a woman with golden hair, and a child were sketched in haphazard lines, yet there was intention in every stroke. At the bottom of one, in uneven, childish scrawl, she wrote, "Mama." The drawings were a window into her silent suffering and a bridge toward connection, fragile but real. Evelyn sat at the table, her hands clasped around the edge, eyes tracing the drawings as if they were some sacred script. She had stumbled upon a folded letter tucked away in the drawer of the old writing desk, a medical note from years past. It revealed a truth she had carried alone for decades. A wound sustained during her time as a field nurse in the Civil War had rendered childbirth a dangerous prospect, perhaps even impossible. The revelation pressed upon her like the weight of a cold stone, fueling a determination to avoid pity, to stand unbowed before anyone who might see weakness. She would not allow this past, this flaw, to dictate how she was treated, especially not by strangers, however noble their intentions. Nantan's own story remained largely unspoken, yet the air seemed charged with it. Born into the Apache tribe, he had grown up amid stories of survival and the harsh laws of the frontier. Before inheriting Red Bluff Ranch, he had been a skilled horse wrangler, navigating the shifting lines between territories and tribes. But his life had been irrevocably altered one night, years ago. He had been drunk, oblivious to the world around him, and by morning, the landscape of his life had been transformed into a tableau of loss. Blood smeared near the back door. Elena, his wife, gone. The town whispered. She had vanished, they said, and Nantan, suspected though never accused, was left with only a wedding ring and the gnawing suspicion that he might have failed in ways he could never remember. The sheriff, a distant cousin, had rushed through explanations, insisting that silence would protect him from scandal. But the shadows of that night remained, unbroken, haunting the corners of the cabin. It was the kind of past that rendered a man both formidable and fragile, a combination that Nantan carried like the weight of the prairie itself. He rarely spoke of it, but the walls of Red Bluff Ranch seemed to echo with it, and the small, quiet gestures he offered Evelyn were as much about his own need for redemption as they were about her comfort. The concept of frontier justice was never far from anyone's mind in these parts. Dust and Destiny's narrator, old and weathered, often reminded listeners, in this land a rope could be strung and a verdict rendered faster than a word of defense could be spoken. Secrets were a currency as valuable as gold or cattle, and footprints in the snow were often the only record of a truth that might never be acknowledged openly. Evelyn felt the weight of these unspoken laws with every cautious step she took in the cabin, knowing that the landscape itself was an accomplice in maintaining silence and fear. But clues were everywhere, subtle and persistent. One afternoon, Evelyn took a risk and ventured to the edge of the forest, meeting Mrs. Hargrove, an elderly neighbor whose eyes seemed to hold the wisdom and sorrow of decades. From her, Evelyn learned fragments of the night Elena disappeared. The old woman had heard screams, seen 2 sets of footprints heading into the woods, and only one returning. Sheriff McCrae, Nantan's relative, had been quick to silence her, urging secrecy under the guise of protection. Evelyn returned to the cabin with these fragments weighing on her, sensing that the truth of the past hovered like a ghost over every creaking floorboard and frosted window pane. Meanwhile, Nita's drawings grew darker, more urgent. One depicted a muscular figure dragging a woman, the child beneath a blazing sun, and the scrawled words, "Pa is sleep." It was not merely a record of memory, but an echo of trauma, a visual diary that demanded interpretation, connection, and care. Evelyn studied these drawings with the precision of a nurse and the empathy of a mother who could not speak the words herself, trying to decipher the cryptic language of fear and hope intermingled. Evelyn's own past became part of the conversation, though she shared it reluctantly. She spoke of her service as a wartime nurse, of holding children as they slipped from life in her arms, and of the explosion that had left her body marked and her spirit heavy. Nantan, ever measured, never allowed pity to cross his expression. Instead, he offered a single word, gruff but sincere: respect. It was a promise, an acknowledgement that survival and dignity could coexist, even in lives scarred by the unrelenting cruelty of history. Yet, despite this gradual thawing, a tangible distance remained. Nantan's wedding ring glinted under the firelight, a stubborn relic of a love lost. Elena's photograph remained above the hearth, a silent sentinel. Even as he draped his heavy coat over Evelyn's shoulders during a gust of frigid wind that slipped through the poorly sealed window, there was a careful boundary maintained, a line between warmth and intrusion, connection and the unhealed wounds of grief. In the midst of these tensions, the cabin became a microcosm of the frontier itself. Within its walls, warmth and cold, life and loss, trust and suspicion coexisted in uneasy harmony. Every glance, every gesture carried weight. The simple act of preparing a meal, of drawing a picture, of sharing a story of survival, became a bridge across years of silence, across cultures and past tragedies, across the often cruel law of the land. By the end of this first week, the rhythms of daily life were frozen, yet gradually warming. Evelyn found herself humming softly while chopping vegetables. Nantan, without a word, ensured the fire never faltered. Nita, emboldened, began to speak simple words again, her voice a hesitant, precious thread weaving through the cabin's still air. Each day offered a glimmer of hope, each night a reminder of the fragility of that hope, in a land governed by wind, snow, and the invisible but omnipresent code of the frontier. And so, in the frozen heart of Montana, Red Bluff Ranch began to breathe again, not only with the fire that warmed the cabin, but with the subtle pulse of lives gradually intertwining, of old wounds acknowledged and new trust cautiously established. The storm outside had cleared, but within these walls, the more dangerous tempests of memory, grief, and the ethical dilemmas of human connection were only just beginning to settle. Every moment held the potential for revelation, betrayal, or redemption, and Dust and Destiny would soon witness just how far courage, love, and integrity could reach in a place where every secret was written in the snow and every act of kindness carried the weight of survival. The horizon was still smeared with snow when a familiar silhouette crested the ridgeline, the sharp outline of a rider against the pale winter sky. Nantan's heart tightened even before recognition settled. Bo Danner, the man who had once been employed at Red Bluff Ranch, returned with the arrogance of a ghost who had wandered too long in the shadows. Inside the cabin, Nita froze, her small body pressed against the floorboards beneath the bed. She clutched a piece of charcoal, and in trembling strokes sketched on the worn wooden planks, a tall man wielding a knife, a shadow dragging a woman, red streaks smeared across the page. Blood, memory, terror. Evelyn, alone in the kitchen, felt the first crash before she heard his words. The door flew open under the force of Danner's push, the bitter wind of the storm trailing him inside. His voice cut through the cabin like a whip, rough and commanding. "The girl remembers now. We must silence her. Cut the tongue of memory." He admitted it all in one breath. That night, when Nantan had been blind to the world, drunken and oblivious, Danner had taken Elena's life and left him to wake up in a haze of blood and suspicion. It was not accident or misfortune. It was murder, deliberate and cruel. The knife flashed in the dim light, a glint of steel that made Evelyn's blood run cold. Instinct and resolve overcame hesitation. She hurled herself in front of Nita, her body a shield against the descending blade. The impact sent a rush of pain through her shoulder, the warmth of blood seeping through her sleeve, and yet her focus never wavered. Red stained the floorboards, a stark contrast to the snow-white world outside, but it was a price she bore willingly. Life, after all, was more precious than fear, and innocence, once threatened, demanded protection at all costs. Nantan reacted with the ferocity of a man who had carried injustice in his bones for years. The gun in his hands barked through the cabin, shattering the storm's lull, the bullets finding their mark. Danner crumpled, the weight of his crimes finally pressing him into the dust of the floor. Within moments, neighbors arrived, summoned by the echoes of gunfire. Among them was a former deputy, eyes widening as recognition struck. "Bo Danner," he muttered, confirmation enough that the nightmare was real. Sheriff McCrae, long reluctant to revisit the past, had no choice but to reopen the case. Amid the chaos, Evelyn sank to the floor beside Nita, her hands still cradling the little girl. Fever and shock racked her body, but her voice, though weak, was firm with reassurance. "It's over, Nita. You're safe now." And in that suspended moment of terror and relief, the child, who had known only silence for 3 long years, called out in a voice fragile yet powerful, "Mama, don't go." The word, so simple, carried a lifetime of longing and the first bridge between past pain and present hope. Nantan fell to his knees, uncharacteristically exposed before the warmth of the fire and the strength of Evelyn's courage. He admitted a truth he had long feared, that the nightmare of Elena's death had not been his fault. Evelyn, by standing in that doorway, shielding Nita, had restored not only his daughter's safety, but also his own stolen innocence. She had returned to him a truth long buried beneath suspicion and self-doubt, and with it, a chance to reclaim life beyond grief. The laws of the town were slow, bureaucratic, and often indifferent. Witnesses, tracks in the snow, the fractured memories of neighbors, all were crucial threads in a justice system that moved at the pace of deliberation rather than instinct. Yet here on the frontier, there was another law, the unspoken code of survival and moral reckoning that had guided lives for decades. The footprints that traced Danner's movements, the terrified sketches of Nita, and the courage of Evelyn's body placed themselves in a hierarchy above the delayed decrees of the courthouse. Frontier justice, messy and immediate, had spoken where parchment and gavel might never have. Danner was bound and taken away, his confession echoing through the icy air. The neighbors' testimonies painted the night vividly. Screams, shadows, tracks in the snow, and the silent courage of a woman who refused to bow to fear. The law would eventually catch up, but the first act of justice had been enacted not by a judge or jury. Nantan's Gaz Evelyn, pale but steadfast, cradled Nita against her chest. The child's small fingers dug into her coat, anchoring herself to the living warmth of the moment. It was the first real sound of voice, the first authentic recognition that the world could be a place of safety and care. Evelyn's own experiences, the battlefield horrors and the loss she had carried, had prepared her for this moment. Yet the reward, a child's trust, way outside, the wind had calmed to a whisper. The snow, disturbed by hoofprints and hurried footprints, now glistened in the weak sunlight, reflecting the cleansing of fear and the fragile emergence of justice. Inside the cabin, The fire crackled as if in celebration, the warmth a counterpoint to the chill that had dominated months, years, perhaps decades of life at Red Bluff Ranch. Every detail, the skewed drawings, the worn floorboards, the charred remnants of the previous night's fire, spoke of trials endured, courage displayed, and justice. In the quiet aftermath, Nantan looked upon Evelyn not as a stranger who had stumbled into his life, but as a force that had restored balance, challenged fear, and returned to him the clarity and dignity he had lost. The frontier had the moral of the story was not found in the courtroom, nor in the delayed verdicts of distant authority. It was written in the footprints pressed into snow, in the charcoal strokes of a child's hands, in the steady heartbeat of a woman who refused to flee. It was a lesson in the harsh, unforgiving ways of the West. Sometimes, justice is immediate, brutal, and deeply human. It is enacted by those who dare, who care, who stand against the cold tide of fear and inertia. As Nantan watched the embers glow, he pondered the question every man and woman on the frontier must answer. When law hesitates, when justice is delayed, will you act? Will you allow frontier justice to rise where the courthouse cannot reach? Or will you wait, perhaps forever, for a gavel that may never fall? In that moment, as Nita slept safely in Evelyn's arms, the answer seemed clear. Courage, mercy, and decisiveness were the laws that truly governed life here, in a land where wind could slice like a knife and snow could bury the unprepared in silence. And so, the Red Bluff Ranch, scarred but standing, became a testament to survival, to the sacrifices that bind strangers into family, and to the justice that rises from action rather than bureaucracy. Evelyn had shielded the innocent, Nantan had reclaimed his honor, and Nita had found her first words of trust. The frontier had tested them, and in its unforgiving way, had delivered a reckoning both terrifying and necessary. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and lingering snow as Evelyn's hands traced the edges of a folded piece of paper she had left on the hearth. The wound that had once left her body battered and broken was healing, but the deeper, invisible scar, the one that whispered she could never bear children, refused to fade. She wrote carefully, her pen scratching across the fragile sheet. An vanita shungdang como tuong laitronven, chico nong mangep. She left it there, hoping that her absence might somehow protect them, yet knowing in her heart it was a coward's choice. The wind outside rose to a howl, carrying a cold promise through the cracks in the cabin walls. Nita, curious and worried, found the letter. The words twisted her heart into knots. For a fleeting, painful moment, she imagined herself as the weight pressing down on the fragile happiness of her two guardians. Without a word, she pulled her woolen cloak tighter, stepped out into the storm, and vanished into the rolling white of the forest. When Nantan discovered her absence, his face went pale beneath the shadow of the cabin. He mounted Lark, the gentle horse that had carried them through countless winters, and rode into the blinding drift. Evelyn followed, her scarf whipped around her face, her lungs burning with each breath. Their calls cut across the wind, hoarse with fear. "Nita!" Snowflakes clung to their eyelashes, melted in the heat of their desperation. Every step, every hoofbeat was a gamble against the cold, a wager with death itself. Here in the wilds of the frontier, combat was not always fought with bullets. Sometimes it was fought with promises, with the resolve not to abandon one another, even when the world seemed determined to do so. Hours passed like years, until finally, under a gnarled pine, they saw her. Nita's small form was huddled against the trunk, cheeks pinched with cold, eyes wide and frightened. Evelyn dropped from the saddle, scooped her daughter into trembling arms, and whispered, her voice cracking with relief. "Mama's here. I'll never leave you. I was afraid I wasn't enough." Nantan pulled his coat over both of them, the three bodies forming a cluster of warmth against the biting wind. His hands shook as he held them close, the weight of fear and relief pressing equally against his chest. "Kon la kongai kwachong ta," he said firmly, letting the words wrap around them like the first rays of sunlight cutting through the storm clouds. "Kong gi thay doi duok du du." And in that embrace, hearts beating together, the first truth settled. A family was not always born. Sometimes it was chosen, and sometimes it was fought for in the snow and ice of the untamed West. Morning arrived like a slow blessing. Frost glistened along the frozen creek, turning every branch and stone into a diamond mirror. Nantan removed Elena's wedding ring, the cold metal heavy with memory, and whispered a quiet farewell to the woman who had once been his past, now a relic he could release. He knelt by the ice, retrieving a small, aged ring that had belonged to his mother. His voice, steady yet soft, carried through the silence. Gia din kong pai noita sinra mala noita chonolai. Evelyn, hayolai. Evelyn looked at him, her eyes wet but unwavering, and responded without words. The answer was carried in the small, insistent squeeze of Nita's hand, bridging the space between the two adults. A promise was made, not in formal vows, but in the quiet, unspoken recognition of mutual trust and shared life. A week later, Fort Banner's humble church opened its doors to the rare warmth of celebration. Snow had receded enough to reveal patches of hardy grass, and the air smelled faintly of sage and winter pine. The ceremony was simple, wildflowers arranged in jars, Evelyn's hair tucked with sprigs of lavender, Nita in a blue dress that had been hers for Sunday school, and laughter, rare and treasured, spilling from lips long accustomed to silence. When the priest asked who would give the bride away, Nita stood tall, a hint of mischief and pride in her small frame. "Khan," she declared. The words rang like a bell across the wooden pews. The old storyteller, who had been watching quietly from the back, muttered to himself, smiling with a wisdom born of decades. Trong mien te ne, doiki, chin mot dua tre lai dua me min vau mot doi moi. Vows were exchanged not only in the language of tradition, but in the resonance of shared struggle. Promises were made to stand together in storms, to choose each other every day, to honor past losses without letting them dictate the future. Every gaze, every touch, carried the weight of endurance, of courage, and the profound simplicity of love chosen rather than inherited. Outside, the land stretched endlessly, indifferent and yet alive with the rhythms of life. The cry of a hawk, the whisper of the river under ice, the wind that sculpted snowdrifts into shapes as ephemeral as memory. Within that vastness, three hearts had found their anchor. A family had been forged not from obligation, but from the deliberate, defiant act of staying, of reaching out, and of holding fast when the world threatened to pull them apart. In the days that followed, the cabin at Red Bluff Ranch became a place of warmth and laughter. Evelyn found purpose in her healing, nurturing Nita's curiosity and teaching her the unspoken rules of frontier life. How to read the sky, how to tend the small garden against frost, how to listen for truth in the silent snow. Nantan repaired the fences and roof, each nail driven a quiet testament to resilience and hope. And Nita, once silent and fearful, filled the spaces with sketches, songs, and stories that wove the fabric of their new life together. The frontier remained wild, unpredictable, and often cruel, but within the circle of hearth and heart, justice had been found, courage had been tested, and love had been chosen. In the West, survival was more than a matter of skill or strength. It was a measure of willingness to act, to care, and to commit. The bonds of family, selected and defended, proved stronger than fear, stronger than loss, stronger than even the coldest snow. And so, in that small church with its modest congregation, in the cabin with its patchwork repairs, and under the endless sweep of the western sky, Nantan, Evelyn, and Nita discovered the truth of the land they called home. That family was not a matter of blood alone, that courage could outshine tragedy, and that the heart, when it chose wisely, could heal the deepest wounds. Here in the snow and sun they were complete, not perfect, but unbreakable, bound not by obligation but by choice, by love, and by the quiet miracles of everyday bravery. In the deserts and blizzards of the Old West, the smallest acts often leave the deepest marks. Evelyn threw herself between Nita and danger, without hesitation, without blood ties, with a heart entirely devoted. This is the power of compassion and sacrifice. Sometimes saving a child who is not your own is the only truth, though buried by fear, family ties, or social pressure, finds its way to the surface. Through Nita's trembling drawings, through a scream lost in the blizzard, through footprints that refuse to lie. Redemption does not need grand apologies. Justice does not wait for perfect law. It is forged by those willing to stand in the fragile line. On a frontier where the law often sleeps, the honor of the brave awakens justice. Nantan, Evelyn, and Nita showed that daring to act, daring to love, daring to choose is the only way to preserve what society may forget. Unfrozen hearts, faith in goodness, and the value of each human family is not merely blood, it is choice. It is the decision to stay together amid snow and wind, amid trials that test every bond. Nita's first word, Mama, is more than a child's sound. It is proof of healing, of shattered pieces stitched back together with love, patience, and courage. In the wind-swept lands where storms strike without warning, no one asks where you come from. They watch whom you stand with when the world turns harsh. This is the Old West philosophy, a lesson in compassion, honor, justice, and chosen family. If this story has touched you, follow Dust and Destiny, share it, and leave a comment. Does frontier justice have a place in your heart, or should it be left entirely to the courts? And if you have a story that has weathered its own storms, send it to the channel's email. Perhaps next time it will be your story told, so someone out there can find the reason to stay.